What if everything you fear about growing old is actually the moment your life finally begins? What if nothing is being taken from you and you have only been holding on too tightly to something that was never yours? Stand at the edge of Australia. Watch the ocean long enough and you may begin to notice something unsettling. Time is not taking you anywhere. It is revealing what you have always been. There is something deeply strange about growing old in Australia. Not strange in the way of confusion, but in the way of quiet revelation, as though the land itself is gently undoing something you have believed your entire life. And if you stand long enough at the edge of the continent, perhaps on a silent stretch of coastline where the ocean moves in vast unhurried breaths, you may begin to notice that nothing here is in a hurry. The waves arrive without urgency. They rise, they fall, they disappear, and yet nothing is lost, nothing is rushed. Nothing is trying to become anything else. And in watching this, something inside you begins to loosen, because you realize perhaps for the first time that what you have been calling time may not be what you thought it was, and you see it reflected not only in the ocean but in the people, especially the older ones, those who rise early in small Australian towns, walking slowly along the shoreline before the sun grows harsh, not walking to arrive anywhere but walking as if the act itself is enough. Carrying nothing but a quiet presence. No longer chasing, no longer measuring, no longer trying to outrun anything, and there is a dignity in that slowness, a kind of freedom that does not announce itself but is felt, as though they have stepped out of something invisible that most people are still trapped inside, because you have been taught, have you not, that life is a journey, that it begins somewhere, moves forward, and must arrive at something meaningful before it ends. That time is a line and you are moving along it. That youth is the beginning, aging is the decline, and death is the final conclusion. And yet the longer you watch the ocean, the less convincing this story becomes, because the waves do not move toward a destination. They rise and fall as expressions of something deeper, something that is not going anywhere at all. And so you begin to suspect that aging is not what you have been told. As a child you were the rising wave, full of expansion, reaching outward, intoxicated by possibility. Everything was ahead of you. Everything was becoming, and you did not question it because becoming felt natural. It felt like life itself. But now as the years pass, that movement changes. It slows, it deepens, it turns inward, and what once felt like expansion begins to feel like loss, and you call this aging. You call this decline. You call this something to resist. But what if nothing is actually being lost? What if the movement is the same, only your interpretation has changed? Australia has a way of confronting you with this question because it is a land that does not fit easily into the narrative of progress. It is too old, too vast, too indifferent to your sense of urgency. The outback does not care how young you are or how old you become. The rocks have seen more time than you can comprehend, and they do not cling to their shape. They erode. They change. They simply exist as part of the same endless process, and in their silence there is a kind of teaching. Not spoken, but undeniable. Nothing is being taken. Everything is changing, and those are not the same thing. There is also something else you begin to notice as you grow older here, something subtle, something that does not appear in philosophy books but is present in everyday life, in the quiet suburbs, in the modest homes, in the worn verandas where people sit in the late afternoon light, not doing anything in particular, not trying to optimize their time, not chasing another goal, just sitting as the day slowly dissolves into evening. And you realize that this simple being was always available, but you were too busy becoming to notice it. And perhaps that is what aging begins to reveal. Not that life is ending, but that the constant need to become something else is finally losing its grip. Because the truth is you have never stopped changing, not for a single moment. From the day you were born until now, everything has been in motion. Your body, your thoughts, your identity, all of it shifting continuously, and yet you created the idea that there was a stable you moving through time, something that should remain intact, something that should not disappear, and when that illusion begins to crack, you call it aging, you call it loss, you call it something tragic. But look again, look at the ocean. Look at the sky over the Australian desert, vast and unmoving, while everything within it changes endlessly, clouds forming, dissolving, light shifting, colors fading, and yet the sky itself remains untouched, not because it resists change, but because it is not separate from it. And what if that is what you are? Not the form that is changing, but the space in which the change is happening. Now, this is not something you need to believe, it is something you can begin to notice very quietly in moments where you are not trying to control anything. Perhaps sitting outside with a cup of tea, watching the light move across the ground, hearing distant sounds without needing to interpret them, and in those moments there is no past, no future, no identity to maintain. There is only this simple awareness, open, effortless, already complete. And it does not grow old, it does not become younger, it simply is. But the mind resists this, of course it does, because it has built its entire structure on the idea of time as something to manage, something to fight, something to win against. And so it clings, it compares, it remembers how things used to be, it measures what has been lost, and in doing so it creates a tension that feels real but is entirely self-created. It is like trying to hold a wave. The tighter you hold, the more quickly it disappears. And yet you have been told your whole life to hold on, to preserve, to maintain, to fight against the natural movement of change, and so when aging begins to show itself more clearly, the resistance increases and with it the suffering. But what if you stopped? What if just for a moment you allowed everything to change without trying to control it? Not as an idea, but as an actual experience. And here is where something remarkable begins to happen. The fear softens, not because you have solved it, but because you are no longer feeding it. And in that softening something else appears, something much quieter, much more subtle, a sense that life was never something you needed to hold together, that it has been unfolding perfectly well without your interference, that even your attempts to control it were part of the unfolding. And in a place like Australia, where the land itself seems to stretch beyond your need for control, this realization becomes almost unavoidable, because the scale of it humbles you, the silence absorbs your noise, and slowly, almost without noticing, you begin to let go, not all at once, but gradually, like a wave returning to the ocean. And if you remain there a little longer, not merely at the edge of the ocean, but at the edge of your own understanding, something even more subtle begins to reveal itself. You begin to sense that growing old is not a movement away from life, but a movement into its depth, like walking inland from a bright, restless shoreline into a vast and quiet interior where everything becomes slower, wider, and strangely more real. Because in youth there is a tendency to skim across the surface of things, to chase experience after experience as though meaning was something to be collected. But as the years unfold, that urgency begins to soften, and what takes its place is not emptiness but sensitivity, a deeper awareness of what has always been here, unnoticed, like the stillness beneath all sound. And you begin to notice this in simple moments, perhaps sitting outside as the afternoon light stretches across a quiet Australian suburb. The faint hum of life in the distance, the kettle cooling the air, settling into evening, and you realize there is nowhere else you need to be, nothing you need to become in order for this moment to be complete. And this realization is both ordinary and profound, because it changes nothing and yet transforms everything. And there is also something about memory that shifts in this process. It no longer behaves like a precise record of the past, but like a dreamlike current where moments appear and dissolve without clear order, distant memories becoming vivid while recent ones fade softly at the edges. And this too is often feared as decline, as though something essential were being lost. But what if this softening is not a failure but a release, a loosening of the mind's need to hold everything in place? Because the more tightly you try to preserve the past, the more it slips away. And yet when you allow it to move freely, it becomes lighter, less burdensome, no longer something you must carry, but something that passes through you like a breeze. And perhaps this is why nostalgia feels both sweet and painful, because it is the echo of a time that was never stable to begin with, only now you are able to see its fluid nature more clearly. And in this clarity, there is less need to return to it, because you begin to recognize that what you are seeking in the past is not located there at all, but here in this present awareness that was always there unnoticed. And in Australia, this realization is quietly mirrored in the land itself, because the distances are vast, the spaces are open, and there is room for your thoughts to expand without being crowded. What once felt like isolation begins to feel like spaciousness, as though the land is gently teaching you how to be alone without feeling incomplete. And in that aloneness there is not loneliness but a kind of fullness, a sense that nothing is missing because nothing was ever separate from you to begin with. And you begin to notice too the quiet rhythm of older lives around you, the familiar faces at a small cafe, the slow conversations that carry no urgency, the brief nod of recognition between strangers who share the same unspoken understanding that there is no longer anything to prove. And in this there is a subtle form of community not built on achievement or identity but on simple presence, and it feels more real because it is no longer trying to be anything else. And perhaps this is one of the deeper shifts that aging brings, the gradual dissolution of the need to define yourself so rigidly, because what you once held as identity begins to feel less solid, less necessary, more like a story than a fact. And as that story loosens, you are not left with nothing, but with something more open, more fluid, something that does not need to be fixed in order to exist. And this openness can feel unfamiliar at first because it does not offer the same sense of control, but if you remain with it without trying to grasp it, you begin to notice a certain ease of freedom that was not available when you were constantly trying to maintain a particular version of yourself. And in that ease, there is also a quiet joy, not the kind that depends on excitement or achievement, but something softer, something that arises from simply being part of what is happening without resistance. And this does not mean that difficulties disappear. The body may still ache, the mind may still wander, moments of uncertainty may still arise, but they are no longer interpreted as problems that must be solved. They are seen as movements within the same flow, and when they are allowed rather than resisted, they pass more easily, like weather moving across an open sky. And this is perhaps one of the most significant changes that occurs with age, not that life becomes easier, but that your relationship to it becomes less strained, less conflicted, because you are no longer trying to force it into a shape that it was never meant to hold. And as this continues, there may come moments when the boundary between what you call yourself and what you call the world becomes less distinct, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, almost unnoticed shift where the division simply feels less convincing than it once did. You watch the wind move through trees and it does not feel separate from your own awareness. You hear the distant sound of waves, and it is not outside you in the way you once assumed. It is part of the same field of experience that includes your thoughts, your sensations, your sense of being. And in this there is no need to conclude anything, no need to define it. It is simply noticed, and in being noticed, it changes the way you understand yourself without requiring any belief at all. And when this understanding deepens, even the fear of ending begins to soften, because you begin to see that what you have been calling yourself was never a fixed entity to begin with. It was always a movement, a pattern, a continuous unfolding. And if that is so, then what is there to end? What is there to lose when there was never anything solid to hold on to? And this is not a conclusion you reach through thinking, but something that becomes evident through direct observation, through watching the way experience itself unfolds moment by moment without needing to be held together. And in that watching, there is a kind of quiet trust, not in the sense of believing something will happen, but in the sense of no longer needing to control what is already happening. And this trust is not something you create, it is something that becomes visible when the need for control begins to fade. And so as you sit once more perhaps by the ocean or beneath the wide Australian sky, watching the light change and the day move without effort, you begin to see that what you once feared as the end was never separate from the beginning, that what you thought was disappearing was simply changing form, and that you have always been part of that movement, not as something within it, but as the movement itself, endlessly appearing, endlessly dissolving, endlessly complete just as it is. And so what begins to emerge is not an answer, but a different way of seeing, as though the question itself has dissolved into something wider, because you are no longer asking how to preserve yourself within time, but beginning to notice that what you are has never been contained by time in the way you once imagined. And this shift is so subtle that it can easily be missed. It does not arrive with clarity or certainty, but with a kind of quiet easing, a release of tension you may not even have realized you were holding. And in that release there is space. Not empty space in the sense of absence, but open space in which everything can appear and disappear without resistance. And perhaps this is why in the later years of life there is often a natural movement towards simplicity, not as a forced discipline, but as an organic unfolding, a letting go of what is unnecessary because it no longer feels real in the same way. The need to impress fades, the need to compare softens, the constant measuring of one's life against an imagined standard begins to lose its meaning. And what remains is not a diminished version of life, but a more direct experience of it. Less filtered, less constructed, less divided. And in Australia, this simplicity is quietly echoed everywhere. In the vastness of the land, in the long stretches of road where nothing happens in the way the mind expects, yet everything is happening in its own rhythm. In the quiet presence of older people who no longer carry the same urgency in their movements, who seem to exist in a different relationship with time, not as something to manage, but as something to move with. And if you observe closely, you may notice that they are not slower because they have lost something, but because they are no longer resisting the pace of life itself. And in that alignment there is a kind of grace that cannot be imitated because it does not come from effort. It comes from the absence of unnecessary effort. And this is perhaps one of the deepest paradoxes of aging, that what appears from the outside as decline may from the inside be a form of liberation. Not from life, but from the illusion of needing to control it. And this liberation does not remove difficulty, but it changes the context in which difficulty is experienced. It is no longer something that threatens your sense of self, because that sense of self is no longer fixed in the same way. It becomes more fluid, more open, more capable of allowing experience without being defined by it. And as this continues, even the idea of becoming begins to lose its hold. Because you begin to see that you have never actually become anything permanent. Every identity you have ever had has shifted, changed, dissolved into something else. And yet throughout all of that there has been this simple, undeniable awareness that has not needed to become anything in order to be present. And in recognizing this, the entire structure of striving begins to soften, not because striving is wrong, but because it is no longer necessary in the same way. You may still act, you may still create, you may still engage with the world, but it is no longer driven by the need to secure yourself within it. It becomes more like a dance than a task, something that arises naturally rather than something you must force into existence. And this changes the quality of everything. Even ordinary moments take on a different texture because they are no longer steps towards something else, they are complete in themselves. Like the sound of wind across an open field, or the quiet rhythm of waves returning again and again without ever needing to arrive anywhere. And perhaps this is why as you grow older there can be a deepening appreciation for what once seemed insignificant, because it is no longer overshadowed by the constant pull of the future. The future which once felt so vast, so necessary, so urgent, now appears as just another idea, another projection that may or may not come to pass. And in the absence of that pressure, the present expands not as a narrow slice of time, but as a wide open field in which everything is already here. And in that field, there is no need to rush, no need to hold, no need to resist. And this does not make life static, it makes it alive in a different way, more immediate, more direct, less entangled in the narratives that once defined it. And as this becomes more familiar, even the concept of an ending begins to shift. Because you begin to see that what you have been calling an ending has been happening continuously all along, every moment dissolving into the next, every form changing into something else, and yet nothing is truly lost because the process itself continues uninterrupted. And so the idea of a final ending begins to lose its sharpness. It becomes less like a cliff and more like a continuation of the same movement that has always been present. And in that recognition, there is a kind of quiet peace, not because you have found a way to escape change, but because you have seen that you are not separate from it. You are not something that is being carried by time, you are the very movement of time itself, appearing as this moment, as this experience, as this life unfolding exactly as it is. And in seeing this, even briefly, there is a profound shift, a sense that there was never anything to hold together, nothing to preserve, nothing to defend. Only this ongoing, unfolding, endlessly changing, endlessly complete. And perhaps this is what it means to grow old, not to lose what you were, but to see more clearly what you have always been. Not as a fixed identity, but as the open, immeasurable field in which all identities arise and pass. And in that seeing there is nothing left to achieve, nothing left to secure, only the simple, undeniable presence of being, here, now, just as it is. And perhaps at last, if one can even speak of a last, there is a sense that the entire movement of your life has never truly been a journey from one point to another, but a continuous unfolding that only appeared as a path because you were looking for a destination. And in seeing this, there is a quiet shift, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but deeply settling, as though something that was once tightly held has simply loosened on its own. And you begin to notice that there is no longer the same urgency to arrive anywhere, because the feeling of needing to arrive was itself part of the illusion. And in its absence, what remains is not emptiness in the sense of lack, but openness in the sense of completeness. An openness that allows everything to be exactly as it is without needing to be corrected or improved or secured. And in this openness, even the idea of letting go begins to dissolve, because there is nothing being held in the first place. And so life continues not as a problem to be solved, but as a movement to be experienced, each moment arising with its own texture, its own rhythm, its own quiet completeness. And you are no longer standing apart from it trying to shape it into something else, but moving with it as it unfolds. Like the ocean that does not resist its own waves, or the sky that does not interfere with the clouds that pass through it. And in this there is a simplicity that cannot be manufactured, because it is not something added to life, but something revealed when the effort to control life falls away. And perhaps nowhere is this more apparent than in the stillness that begins to appear more frequently, not as an absence of activity, but as a deeper presence within it. A sense that even when nothing is happening, everything is quietly alive. The breath moving the body, resting the world continuing without needing your intervention. And in that stillness, there is no separation between observer and observed, no distance between you and what is happening, because the idea of separation was never more than a useful illusion. And when that illusion fades even slightly, there is a kind of intimacy with existence itself that cannot be described, only lived. And this intimacy carries with it a gentle trust, not a belief in a particular outcome, but a recognition that whatever unfolds is part of the same indivisible movement that has always been present. And in that recognition, even the thought of an ending loses its weight, because what would it mean for a movement to end when it has never been fixed in the first place? What would it mean for something to disappear when it has always been in the process of appearing and disappearing simultaneously? And so what you once called death begins to look less like a final event and more like another expression of the same process that has carried you through every moment of your life. Not something separate, not something to be feared, but something already contained within the very nature of change itself. And in seeing this, there is no need to resolve it, no need to understand it completely, because the need for complete understanding was itself part of the effort to secure something that cannot be secured. And as that effort fades, what remains is a quiet acceptance, not as a decision, but as a natural state that arises when resistance is no longer necessary. And in that acceptance, there is a profound ease, a sense that nothing has been wasted, nothing has been lost, nothing has been incomplete, because the idea of completeness was never dependent on reaching a final point, but on recognizing that each moment has always been whole in itself. And so as you sit perhaps once more at the edge of the ocean, watching the waves rise and fall without urgency, without conclusion, you begin to see not a metaphor, but a direct expression of what you are: the same movement, the same rhythm, the same endless appearing and dissolving that has never been separate from the vastness in which it occurs. And in that seeing, there is nothing left to hold on to, nothing left to let go of, only the quiet, continuous unfolding of life itself, just as it is now and always. And perhaps this is the final understanding, if it can be called that, not something you arrive at, but something that remains when the need to arrive has disappeared. A simple, silent recognition that what you are has never been confined to any moment, any form, any identity, and that in this freedom there is nothing to fear, nothing to achieve, nothing to lose, only this boundless, effortless movement of being which was never truly yours and yet has never been separate from you even for a single moment.